The air in the private dining room of Le Ciel Étoilé was thick enough to be carved. It smelled of old money, seared scallops, and a cloying, unspoken contempt. Arthur Pendleton sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, a granite island in a sea of youthful arrogance. His suit was a simple, impeccably tailored navy wool, a stark contrast to the flashy, razor-thin lapels and jewel-toned silks worn by the three men opposite him. They were the architects of the future, or so they believed. He was just the man with the checkbook. Julian Croft, the CEO of Ethelred Innovations, swirled a Bordeaux in his glass that cost more than the average monthly salary. His smile was a predatory slash of white teeth. "Arthur," he began, the name rolling off his tongue with practiced condescension, "we appreciate you coming all this way. I know the flight from Chicago can be a bit trying for a man of your vintage." Beside him, Marcus Thorne, the CFO, a man with the cold eyes of a shark and the pallor of someone who only saw sunlight through tinted limousine windows, gave a dry chuckle. Bradley Finch, the COO and Julian's primary sycophant, laughed a little too loudly. Arthur said nothing. He simply watched them, his gaze steady and unreadable. He had spent 67 years on this earth, building an empire from the dust of his father's failed dreams. He had faced down corporate raiders, hostile governments, and market crashes that had wiped out lesser men. The preening of these three boys, who had inherited a legacy they now sought to cash in, was little more than the buzzing of flies. "The deal," Julian continued, gesturing to the thick stack of documents in the center of the table, bound in rich blue leather, "is, as you know, historic. $800 million. A fair price to take our little legacy company off our hands and put it into your museum." More chuckles. They saw him as a relic, a collector of corporate antiquities. They had no idea what Ethelred Innovations truly meant to him. They saw a balance sheet, a collection of patents, and a stepping stone to their next venture capital-funded playground. Arthur saw the ghost of his father, a brilliant engineer who had poured his soul into the company's foundations, only to be cast aside by Julian's own father, a man with a silver spoon in his mouth and ice in his veins. A young waitress named Clara entered the room, her movements quiet and precise. She refilled Arthur's water glass, her eyes flicking nervously toward the trio of executives. She had seen their type before, men who treated service staff as invisible furniture. "Something stronger for you, Arthur," Marcus drawled, tapping his own wine glass. "A brandy, perhaps? To steady the hand before the big moment?" Arthur met Clara's eyes for a brief second, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. He then turned his gaze back to Marcus. "Water is fine," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble that seemed to absorb the room's nervous energy. "I prefer to have a clear head when I'm conducting business." Julian smirked. "Of course, due diligence and all that. Well, feel free to read it all again, but our lawyers at Sullivan and Cromwell have been over it with a fine-tooth comb. It's ironclad." He slid the bound contract across the polished table. It stopped a few inches from Arthur's hands. "The culmination of your life's work, I suppose. Buying up the past. A noble hobby. The humiliation was a delicate poison, administered in 1,000 tiny doses. The comments about his age, the insinuation that he was a doddering old fool, the casual dismissal of his entire career as a hobby. They thought they were negotiating from a position of power. They were young, they were disruptive, they were the future. He was the past, a dinosaur with a fat wallet, and they were about to fleece him." Arthur placed his hands on the table, his fingers broad and calloused from a youth spent in machine shops, not boardrooms. He looked at the contract. He looked at the three smug faces watching him, their eyes glinting with greed. They had no idea that the game they were playing had been won by him before they had even sat down. They thought this was the end of the negotiation. For Arthur Pendleton, it was only the beginning of the lesson. The meal was an exercise in calculated cruelty. Julian regaled his partners with loud, boisterous stories of their latest exploits in Dubai and Monaco, each tale punctuated with a pointed glance at Arthur, as if to highlight the chasm between their vibrant, fast-paced world and his presumably quiet, sepia-toned existence. They discussed disruptive technologies Arthur had supposedly never heard of, using a lexicon of acronyms and buzzwords designed to exclude and belittle. You see, Arthur, the synergy in the Web3 space is all about decentralized authentication, Marcus explained, his tone that of a patient teacher explaining a simple concept to a child. Ethelred has the foundational patents, but it lacks the agility. We were going to pivot the entire company, but your offer was simply too good to refuse. A golden parachute, you might say. More like a golden anchor for him, Bradley Finch chimed in, wiping a dollop of saffron foam from his lip. He'll weigh it down with bureaucracy and quarterly reports. The spirit of innovation will be gone in 6 months. Arthur simply ate his sea bass, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He listened, absorbing every barb, every sneer. He catalogued them, not with anger, but with a cold, dispassionate clarity. Each insult was another piece of evidence, another justification for the verdict he was about to deliver. Clara, the waitress, returned to clear the plates. As she reached for Julian's, he waved a dismissive hand without looking at her, still deep in his monologue. The problem with old guard industrialists is a failure to embrace risk. They want predictable returns, 5-year plans. They don't understand that in today's market, you either create the tsunami or you drown in it. He made an expansive gesture, his hand striking the base of his wineglass. The deep red liquid sloshed over the rim, splashing directly onto the blue leather cover of the contract. A dark, ugly stain spread across the pristine surface. "Ah!" Julian exclaimed with a theatrical gasp that held no real apology. "Clumsy of me." He looked at Clara, his eyes hardening. "Well, don't just stand there. Clean it up." Clara froze for a second, startled. Before she could move, Arthur had already taken his own linen napkin and was calmly dabbing at the spill. "It's quite all right," Arthur said, his voice even. "No harm done." "Nonsense," Julian scoffed, leaning back in his chair and waving a hand at the waitress. The girl was in the way. In our offices, an intern would be fired for less. He then turned back to Arthur, a smug grin playing on his lips. "Don't you worry, Arthur. A little wine stain won't invalidate the terms. The ink inside is what matters, eh?" It was a power play, a deliberate act of disrespect to both the waitress and to the sanctity of the agreement. It was meant to show that he, Julian Croft, was so powerful, so untouchable, that he could casually deface an $800 million document and blame it on a server. Arthur folded the stained napkin and placed it beside his plate. He looked at the dark blotch on the leather. It was fitting. A blemish on the legacy his father had helped build, put there by the careless hand of the founder's unworthy son. "Now," Julian said, clapping his hands together, his mood brightening as he sensed the finality of the moment. "I believe we've delayed long enough. The champagne is on ice. Shall we make it official?" He pushed the stained contract back to the center of the table. Marcus produced a pen, a ridiculously ornate Mont Blanc with gold filigree. "For the signing," he said, offering it to Arthur. "A pen worthy of the occasion." Arthur ignored the offered pen. He reached into the inner pocket of his simple navy suit and withdrew his own. It was a plain, well-worn fountain pen, its black casing polished smooth by decades of use. It was his father's pen, the one he had used to draft the very first schematics for the components that had made Ethelred Innovations a powerhouse in the first place. He uncapped it. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant clatter of silverware from the main dining hall. The 3 men leaned forward, their faces alight with triumphant greed. They were moments away from being fabulously, obscenely wealthy. They watched the old man, the relic, the dinosaur, as he lowered the nib to the first signature line. The scratching of the pen on the thick, creamy paper was the only sound in the world. Page after page, he signed. His hand was as steady as the bedrock of the continent. With the final, deliberate stroke of his father's pen, it was done. Arthur Pendleton's signature, a mark of unimpeachable credit and honor in the financial world for 40 years, now graced every required line of the document. He methodically blotted the last page with a small sheet of paper from his pocket, a habit from an era before quick-drying ink. Julian Croft could barely contain his glee. He was already mentally spending the money, picturing the yacht, the penthouse, the fawning articles in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. "Congratulations, Arthur," he said, his voice thick with false magnanimity. You are now the proud owner of Ethelred Innovations. I trust you'll take good care of her." Marcus and Bradley were beaming, their shoulders visibly relaxing as the tension of the long negotiation finally dissipated. Marcus reached for the contract, intending to whisk it away to their lawyers. But Arthur did not push it back across the table. Instead, he carefully squared the thick stack of pages, tapping them on the mahogany until the edges were perfectly aligned. The room, which had been on the verge of erupting into self-congratulatory cheers, fell silent again. The three young executives watched him, their smiles faltering with confusion. What was the old man doing? Arthur Pendleton reached into his suit jacket once more. This time, he did not produce a pen. He brought out a leather case. From it, he extracted a large dark cigar, a Cohiba Behaik, a symbol of ultimate celebration and luxury. Then he produced a silver cigar cutter. With a precise snick, he clipped the end. Julian's confusion morphed into amusement. "Starting the celebration already, Arthur? A bit presumptuous, but I like your style. A victory smoke." He laughed, a loud braying sound that echoed in the quiet room. "A fine choice. Cuban, I presume?" Arthur did not answer. He placed the unlit cigar between his lips and looked around the room. His eyes passed over the smug faces of Julian, Marcus, and Bradley. They settled on Clara, the waitress, who was standing quietly by the service door, waiting to be summoned or dismissed. "Young lady," Arthur said, his voice calm and clear, "would you be so kind as to bring me a book of matches from the bar? Nothing fancy, the simple cardboard ones will do." Julian scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous." He pulled a lighter from his pocket. It was solid gold, a DuPont, and it gleamed under the soft lights. "Allow me, Arthur. A cigar of that quality deserves a proper flame." He flicked it on, the jet flame hissing with a tiny controlled fury. Arthur's gaze did not leave Clara. He completely ignored Julian and his proffered flame. He gave the young waitress a slight encouraging nod. Hesitantly, she scurried from the room. The three men exchanged bewildered glances. This was a bizarre breach of protocol. A power move, an old man's eccentricity. They couldn't decipher it. The air grew thick with unspoken questions. Clara returned a moment later, a small book of restaurant-branded matches in her trembling hand. She approached the table and offered them to Arthur. "Thank you, Clara," he said, taking them. He made a point of using her name. It was the first time anyone at the table had acknowledged her as a person. He opened the book, tore out a single match, and struck it against the flint strip. A small sulphurous flame flared to life, casting flickering shadows on the stunned faces around the table. Julian, Marcus, and Bradley watched, transfixed. They expected him to lift the flame to the tip of the magnificent cigar. They expected him to take his well-deserved celebratory puff. Arthur Pendleton did not light his cigar. With a hand that was as steady as the day it first learned to hold a tool, he lowered the flickering match. He touched it not to the cigar, but to the corner of the $800 million contract he had just signed. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The small flame seemed to hesitate, kissing the corner of the thick, expensive paper. Then the fibers darkened, curled, and a tiny wisp of smoke, thin and grey, spiraled into the air. A small orange ember bloomed at the edge of the page, and with a soft, hungry whisper, it began to grow. The collective intake of breath from the other side of the table was sharp and ragged. The smirks, the arrogance, the triumphant gleams in their eyes, all vanished, replaced by a uniform mask of utter, uncomprehending shock. "What? What are you doing?" Julian stammered, his voice a choked squeak. He half rose from his chair, his knuckles white where he gripped the table. The flame, no longer small, licked its way up the side of the stacked pages. The blue leather cover began to blister and blacken. The unique, acrid smell of burning chemicals and paper filled the opulent room. "Pendleton, have you lost your mind?" Marcus Thorne hissed, his face ashen. "That's a legally binding document. That's our $800 million. Arthur remained seated, perfectly calm. He watched the fire consume his own signature, the ink turning from black to brown to nothingness. He was the eye of a storm of his own making, an island of tranquility, while the world of the three men opposite him began to shatter. "Stop him!" Bradley Finch yelled, finally jolted from his stupor. He lunged forward, reaching for the burning pile of paper. Arthur didn't even flinch. He simply raised his eyes to meet Finch's. The look in them was not one of madness or senility. It was a gaze of absolute chilling authority. It was the look of a predator who had just allowed the prey to walk into the very center of its trap. Finch froze, his hand hovering over the flames, suddenly paralyzed by a fear he couldn't name. The fire was growing stronger now, feeding on the dry paper. The top page curled completely, turning into a brittle black scroll before collapsing into glowing embers. The fire was eating its way through the document, devouring clauses, appendices, and signatures with indiscriminate hunger. $800 million was turning to smoke and ash on a mahogany table in a Michelin-starred restaurant. Julian finally found his voice again, though it was now shrill with panic. "Security! Somebody call security! He's destroying the contract! He's insane!" Clara, the waitress, stood pressed against the wall, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. She had never witnessed anything like this. Arthur let them panic. He allowed the chaos to swell, to fill every corner of the room, to reflect the pandemonium that was now raging in their minds. He waited until the fire had consumed nearly half the stack, until the heat was a tangible presence between them. Then he calmly picked up the burning contract. The flames licked at his fingertips, but he showed no sign of pain. He held the fiery ruin aloft for a moment, a torch made of broken dreams and nullified futures. He brought the burning paper to the tip of his Cohiba cigar. He puffed. Once, twice. The end of the cigar glowed a perfect cherry red. He then casually dropped what was left of the contract into a silver ice bucket on the table, where it landed with a loud hiss, sending up a plume of steam and smoke. The fire was extinguished, leaving behind a charred, sodden lump of what was once a fortune. Arthur leaned back in his chair. He took a long, slow draw from his freshly lit cigar and blew a perfect, fragrant smoke ring toward the ceiling. It hung in the air above the table, a halo over the scene of devastation. The room was deathly quiet now, save for the ragged breathing of the three ruined men. They stared at the smouldering remains in the ice bucket, then at the calm, implacable face of Arthur Pendleton. The question hung unspoken in the air, a silent, desperate scream. Why? Arthur took another puff from his cigar. He finally broke the silence, his voice low, measured, and laced with the ice of a vengeance served decades cold. "Gentlemen," he said, his eyes locking onto Julian's, "you seem to be under a slight misapprehension." "A misapprehension," Julian Croft repeated, his voice trembling with a rage that was rapidly being eclipsed by a dawning, terrifying dread. "You just set fire to $800 million. That's not a misapprehension. That's corporate suicide. It's insanity." Arthur took another placid puff of his cigar, letting the smoke curl from his lips before he spoke. "The $800 million was never for you. It was for the company. A cash infusion to keep it solvent. A lifeline. I have simply decided not to extend it." Marcus Thorne, the numbers man, the CFO, shook his head, trying to process the logic. "That makes no sense. Why would you go through all this? The negotiations, the due diligence, the lawyers, just to back out at the last second? The penalty clauses alone will be staggering." Arthur smiled, a thin, cold expression that did not reach his eyes. "Ah, the penalty clauses. Yes, I'm quite familiar with them. My lawyers drafted them after all, but one can only be penalized if one is in breach of a contract. And as you can see," he gestured with his cigar toward the ice bucket, "there is no contract." The simplicity of the act was as brutal as its execution. There was no document to enforce, no agreement to breach. There was only ash and steam. "But why?" Bradley Finch whispered, his bravado completely gone, leaving behind a quivering, pale-faced man. "Why do this to us?" Arthur set his cigar down in a heavy crystal ashtray. He folded his hands on the table and leaned forward, his gaze sweeping over the three of them, pinning them to their chairs. The kindly old man was gone. In his place sat a titan of industry, ready to deliver judgment. "You believe you are innovators," he began, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet commanding the room entirely. "Disruptors. You talk of tsunamis and agility. But you are none of those things. You are undertakers. You inherited a great company, a legacy of true innovation, and you have spent the last 5 years stripping it for parts, leveraging its assets, and driving it to the very brink of insolvency, all to fund your decadent lifestyles. Julian opened his mouth to protest, but Arthur silenced him with a raised finger. You think I don't know? You think my due diligence was just a formality? For the last 6 months, my team at Pendleton Global has done a forensic audit of Ethelred and of the three of you. We know about the offshore accounts in the Caymans, Julian. We know about the consulting fees paid to shell corporations owned by your girlfriend. We know about the company jet you used for your ski trips to Gstaad. He then turned his cold eyes on Marcus. We know about the $90 million loan you took from Blackstone, secured against Ethelred's patent portfolio, a portfolio you had already leveraged in a deal with KKR. A classic case of fraud, Mr. Thorne. I believe the SEC will be very interested in that. Marcus's face went from pale to ghostly white. He looked like he was going to be sick. And you, Mr. Finch, Arthur continued, his gaze falling on the COO, your scheme of over-ordering raw materials through a supplier you secretly own, then selling the excess on the black market, was amateurish. But profitable, I'll grant you that. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, letting them understand that he knew everything. Their secret, sordid little world had been laid bare. Your company, Arthur stated, the words falling like gavel strikes, is a house of cards. It is drowning in debt. The deal with me was your only way out. The $800 million infusion was the finger in the dam. Without it, the dam breaks. He picked up his cigar again. For the past 3 months, I haven't just been performing due diligence. I've been buying your debt. Through a series of holding companies and intermediaries, Pendleton Global has become your primary creditor. Blackstone, KKR, JP Morgan, they all sold their positions to me at a significant discount, I might add. They knew you were a sinking ship. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The horror on their faces was absolute. It was no longer about a lost sale. It was about total, utter ruin. The covenants on those loans are quite strict, Arthur said conversationally. They are all triggered by a failure to secure new funding by the end of this fiscal quarter, which, as I'm sure you know, is midnight tonight. He glanced at the simple, elegant watch on his wrist. You have about 2 hours. Julian Croft stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. You planned this. All of it. The humiliation, the insults. You sat there and took it. Oh, I did, Arthur confirmed, a flicker of something hard and ancient in his eyes. I wanted to see the men you were. I wanted to be sure. And you did not disappoint. You are exactly like your father, Julian. Arrogant, cruel, and careless. He leaned back, the story now coming to its true and final point. You see, this was never about business. Not really. 45 years ago, a brilliant engineer poured his heart and soul into this company. His name was Robert Pendleton. He was my father. And your father, Julian, fired him, cast him aside with a month's severance after 20 years of service because he wouldn't compromise on safety standards for a new product line. Your father chose profits over integrity. He broke my father's spirit. The air in the room was electric with the weight of decades-old history. My father died a few years later, a proud but broken man. And I made a promise to his memory, that one day I would own the company that discarded him. Not to run it, not to celebrate it, but to pass judgment on the people who had corrupted his legacy. He looked at the three of them, their futures dissolving before their very eyes. You humiliated me tonight. You mocked my age, my clothes, my values. You spilled wine on this deal and blamed a young woman who was only doing her job. You proved that the rot that began with your father has festered in all of you. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the table. He took one last long puff from his cigar, the glowing end a miniature sun of destruction. So no, I am not buying your company. I am foreclosing on it. As of midnight tonight, my firm will take possession of all of Ethelred's assets to cover your outstanding debts. The patents, the factories, the real estate, everything. You will be left with nothing. He let the words hang in the air, a death sentence delivered in a calm, even tone. "Gentlemen," Arthur Pendleton said, his voice dropping to a final, devastating whisper, "you're bankrupt." The silence that followed was more profound than any shout could ever be. It was the sound of worlds ending. Julian Croft's face contorted, disbelief warring with a volcanic rage. He shot to his feet, slamming his hands on the table so hard the crystal glasses jumped. "Bankrupt? You old bastard. You think you can just erase us?" Marcus Thorne was making small, gasping sounds, his chest heaving. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling too much to unlock it on the first try. He finally managed, his thumb swiping frantically. "My broker, I have to—" "Margin calls," he mumbled, the words a frantic, terrified litany. The shark had become a fish gasping for air on the deck of a boat, watching the tide go out. Bradley Finch, the sycophant, immediately turned on his benefactor, his voice a desperate whining plea. He scrambled backward, away from Julian, as if his proximity were contagious. "Julian, this is your fault. You pushed too hard. You had to mock him. I told you we should have taken the first offer. I told you he was dangerous." "Shut up, Bradley," Julian screamed, spittle flying from his lips. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, were fixed on Arthur. He pointed a trembling finger across the table. "This isn't over. My father will hear about this. He has connections you can't even imagine. He'll crush you. He'll sue you into the Stone Age." "Your father," Arthur interrupted, his voice cutting through the hysteria like a shard of ice. He remained standing, a pillar of calm control. "Your father received a full, unredacted copy of my forensic audit this afternoon via secured courier. He knows about the Cayman accounts, the fraudulent loans, the embezzlement. He knows his son has not only run the family company into the ground, but has also committed a series of felonies in the process." Arthur paused, letting the cold reality sink in. "The only call you'll be getting from him is from his legal team, informing you that you have been written out of his will and formally disowned. He is an old man playing golf in Florida, Julian, and he will sacrifice his son to protect what's left of the family name. The Crofts have always been survivors." That was the blow that broke him. Julian staggered back as if physically struck, his face crumbling. The bravado, the arrogance, all of it evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, entitled boy who had just lost all his toys and been abandoned by his creator. But his terror was quickly consumed by a final desperate surge of narcissistic rage. "No," he snarled, his voice low and shaking. "No, you don't get to do this, not to me." He shoved his chair back violently and stormed to the door, flinging it open. He burst out into the main dining hall. The effect was instantaneous. The refined, hushed atmosphere of Le Ciel Étoilé shattered. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations died in mid-sentence. 100 pairs of eyes, the eyes of New York's financial, cultural, and political elite, turned to the source of the disturbance. "This man is a fraud," Julian shrieked, his voice echoing in the sudden cavernous silence. He pointed a shaking finger back into the private room at Arthur, who had not moved. "Arthur Pendleton is a corporate raider, a thief. He just destroyed a legal contract. He's trying to steal my company." Arthur slowly picked up his cigar and walked to the doorway, standing there framed like an actor on a stage. He looked out at the sea of stunned faces, his own expression one of weary calm. He didn't need to say a word. The restaurant manager, Mr. Dubois, materialized beside Julian, his face a mask of cold fury. "Mr. Croft, you are causing a disturbance. I must ask you to leave." "Leave?" Julian laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "I'm not going anywhere. This restaurant is complicit. You're all in on it." He looked wildly around the room, his eyes pleading for an ally, for someone to believe him. "Don't you see? He's a dinosaur, a relic. He can't stand that we're the future." At a corner table, a man with a familiar, hawkish face, Lawrence Vance, the most feared columnist for the Wall Street Journal, slowly lowered his wineglass. He looked at Arthur, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a silent confirmation. Vance didn't just take out a notepad. He discreetly tapped his phone, and a tiny red light indicated he was recording. "Mr. Croft," Vance's voice cut through the room, clear and sharp. "Are you saying the foreclosure on Ethelred's debt, which my sources say is imminent, is fraudulent?" The mention of foreclosure, of specific financial details, was a public death blow. It told the entire room this was not a dispute. It was an execution. Julian's face went slack. It was this, the public confirmation that finally broke Bradley Finch. He scrambled out of the private room, his face slick with sweat. He fell to his knees beside Arthur's legal team, who had just entered. "It's not true," he babbled, grabbing at the trouser leg of the lead counsel, Ms. Albright. "Julian made us do it. The fraud, the loans, it was all him. I'm a victim here. I'll testify. I'll tell you everything." Marcus Thorne remained in the private room, his phone having slipped from his nerveless fingers, his head in his hands, audibly weeping. The sight was pathetic, a tableau of utter ruin. The sycophant betraying his master on the floor, the master screaming into a void of silent contempt, and the architect of it all watching, a wisp of cigar smoke, the only thing moving in the frozen scene. Mr. Dubois spoke again, his voice now like chips of granite. "My father was a machinist at Ethelred for 30 years, Mr. Croft. Your father fired him 2 weeks before his pension vested, to save a few $1,000s. Security will now escort you out." Two large men in subtle but effective dark suits emerged from the wings. As they took Julian's arms, he finally seemed to understand the totality of his defeat. He wasn't just ruined, he was a public spectacle, a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails and stock tickers for years to come. His legacy, cemented in a single, humiliating moment. As they led him away, still babbling threats and denials, Arthur walked over to Clara, who was pressed against the wall, her face pale. He paused before her. "Integrity is the only currency that matters," he said, his voice low and for her alone. "They were bankrupt long before they walked into this room." He pressed a simple, elegant business card into her hand. "Call my office on Monday. I noticed your composure tonight. Your quiet dignity. Those are qualities I value. I think you'll find we have an opening for someone with your discretion and character." Ms. Albright, his lawyer, stepped past them and into the private room, her partner Mr. Shaw following. She stopped in front of the weeping Marcus Thorne and placed a single thick envelope on the table in front of him. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion, "this is a notice of immediate asset seizure, pursuant to the personal guarantees you signed on the Blackstone loan. Your accounts are frozen as of 10 minutes ago. A federal marshal is waiting for you at your home." Arthur gave a final kind nod to Clara. "I'll see you in Chicago." With that, he and Dubois turned. Arthur walked through the main dining hall. The silence held, but it was no longer one of shock. It was one of respect. He had not raised his voice, had not broken a sweat. He had simply held up a mirror, and the monsters had destroyed themselves. 3 months later, Arthur stood not in his office, but on the factory floor of Ethelred Innovations. The air smelled of lubricating oil and hot metal, a scent he hadn't experienced in 50 years, but which felt more like home than any boardroom. The plant, which had been slated for closure by Julian, was now humming with life. He'd not only saved the company, he'd rehired the 300 workers who had been laid off, many with back pay. His office door opened and Clara Romano entered. She wore a smart pantsuit and safety glasses and carried a tablet with the confidence of someone who belonged there. She was no longer a waitress, but the newly appointed director of the Pendleton Foundation, and her first project was overseeing the revitalization of Ethelred. "Sir, the refit of Line 3 is complete, ahead of schedule," she said, her voice clear and steady over the din of machinery. "And the first round of selections for the Robert Pendleton Engineering Scholarship are ready for your review. We have over 5,000 applicants. The criteria you set, focusing on talent from underserved communities, kids whose parents work with their hands, has brought in some astonishing candidates." "Good," Arthur said, taking the tablet. He scrolled through the profiles, seeing the faces of bright, ambitious young people, their dreams detailed in earnest essays. "Let's double the number of recipients for the inaugural year. Send a message." "Yes, sir," she replied with a genuine smile. On the tablet, she swiped to a news summary page she had prepared. The headline from Vance's column was stark. "The Fall of Croft, How Arrogance and Greed Devoured a Legacy." Below it were smaller updates. Marcus Thorne had taken a plea deal, agreeing to testify against his former partners in exchange for a reduced sentence of 7 years. Bradley Finch, having been granted immunity, was last seen working as a car salesman in a New Jersey suburb. And at the bottom, a grainy photo of Julian Croft, looking gaunt and disheveled, leaving a courthouse after being denied bail. Arthur looked at the photos for a long moment. He felt no triumph, only a quiet, somber satisfaction. Vengeance was a fire that burned itself out, but legacy was a foundation. He looked away from the screen, toward the factory floor. He saw a young engineer, one of the new scholarship interns, showing an older, rehired machinist a design on a tablet. The old man nodded, then pointed to a detail, his hands, calloused and sure, explaining a practical reality the classroom couldn't teach. They were building something together. That night wasn't just about tearing them down, he said, more to himself than to Clara. It was about creating the space to build something better in their place, something that lasts. He was done settling the debts of the past. It was time to invest in the future. He looked at Clara, who was already efficiently drafting the memo to double the scholarships, her brow furrowed in concentration. The future, he thought, was in very good hands.